The city buzzed with life, its streets teeming with people going about their day, oblivious to the looming protest. Elena stood at the edge of the main square, adjusting her tote bag filled with flyers and rally materials. Her tall, confident figure and expressive gestures drew attention, even in the chaotic urban crowd. She was a seasoned activist, known for her fiery speeches and relentless commitment to fighting for racial and social justice. Elena believed deeply in dismantling systemic oppression, and today's protest was another step in her mission to bring equality into focus. Elena checked her phone for updates from her team as she rehearsed the key points of her speech in her head. The protest would gather hundreds, maybe thousands, and she was slated as one of the main speakers. Her voice, as always, would rise above the chants, calling for change and reminding people that silence equaled complicity. She had given this speech, in various forms, countless times before. Yet each time felt like an urgent call to action, a chance to push the movement forward. As she scanned the bustling square, her eyes locked momentarily on a woman lingering near the edge of the protest site. The woman, who looked tired and out of place, wore tattered clothes and carried a small, battered backpack. She appeared hesitant, as if unsure whether she belonged in this space. Moments later, the woman approached. Her face, lined with years of hardship, softened as she tried to smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but clear. "I need help. Anything you can spare." Elena's practiced focus faltered. She glanced at the woman, Kendall, though she didn't know her name yet, and then back at her phone, a reflex to avoid the discomfort of the moment. "I'm sorry," Elena replied, her voice polite but dismissive. "I can't right now. Maybe try one of the shelters nearby." Kendall's hopeful expression faded as quickly as it had appeared. She nodded, murmured a quiet thank you, and turned away. Elena's gaze lingered on Kendall for a brief moment, but then her phone buzzed with a message from her team, snapping her back to the task at hand. She brushed off the encounter, telling herself she had bigger issues to tackle today. The protest began soon after, with chants filling the air and banners waving high. Elena's speech drew thunderous applause, her impassioned words resonating with the crowd. But in the back of her mind, the image of Kendall lingered, her tired eyes, her quiet voice asking for help. Unbeknownst to Elena, this brief encounter would challenge her deeply held beliefs and force her to confront the gap between her ideals and her actions. Today, she had spoken for the oppressed on a grand stage, but she had failed to truly see one standing right in front of her. It was a moment that would set the stage for a journey of self-discovery, one that would change her activism and her understanding of justice forever. Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her laptop. Her calendar was packed, meetings, workshops, speaking engagements, all revolving around her tireless crusade for racial equality. Her phone buzzed with notifications, each one a reminder of her status as a prominent activist. She had earned a reputation as a fierce advocate for justice, tirelessly lecturing about dismantling systemic racism, attending protests, and leading community initiatives. Her life had become a whirlwind of speeches and events, where she was celebrated as a leader in the movement. But even as she checked off each task from her list, something was missing. Her mind wandered back to the protest earlier in the day, into the brief encounter with Kendall, the homeless woman who had asked for help. Elena had brushed her off without a second thought, despite her deep commitment to fighting for the oppressed. She had told herself that her focus on systemic issues was the greater fight, fighting the system, not just individual needs. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more a small seed of doubt began to take root. Elena's upbringing had been far removed from the struggles she fought to address. She had grown up in a comfortable, well-off family, where her parents had been advocates for progressive causes, donating to charity and attending rallies in support of equality. They lived in a nice home in an affluent neighborhood, where the harsh realities of poverty and homelessness were distant concepts. Elena had received an education in the best schools, never having to worry about where her next meal would come from or whether she could afford her textbooks. Privilege had surrounded her every day, providing her with opportunities and comfort that most could only dream of. Her life had been filled with lessons about justice, discussions about inequality and social change were common at the dinner table. Elena believed in those ideals with all her heart, but she had never been forced to confront the reality of those issues. She had read about poverty, racism, and inequality in books, discussed it in class, and led protests, but her life had never truly reflected those struggles. It was easy to speak about change when you were untouched by the systems you were fighting against. Now, Elena couldn't ignore the growing discomfort inside her. How genuine was her commitment to the cause if she couldn't even take the time to help a woman like Kendall? She had spoken for hours about dismantling oppressive systems, yet when confronted with a person who was living in the very system she condemned, she had turned away. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a product of her privilege, her distance from the realities of the marginalized communities she spoke for. Elena began to question her own activism. She had always prided herself on being a voice for the voiceless, but was she truly hearing them? Was her activism just a way to feel good about herself, to gain recognition, without actually engaging with the people whose struggles she claimed to understand? As the doubt gnawed at her, Elena realized that her path needed to change. It wasn't enough to lecture about justice from a distance, it was time to get closer to the people she aimed to help. It was time to go beyond words and confront the uncomfortable truths about herself. Kendall's life had been a series of battles, each one more intense than the last. Born into a poor family, she knew hardship from an early age. Her mother, a single parent, worked long hours to make ends meet, and her younger brother struggled with the pressure of living in a neighborhood where crime and poverty were the daily norm. Despite their best efforts, Kendall's family was never really safe from the threat of homelessness. When her mother fell ill, the little stability they had crumbled. The hospital bills piled up, and Kendall's world began to disintegrate. When her mother died, it was the end of everything Kendall had known. Her brother, already lost in his own battles with addiction, spiraled further, and eventually disappeared from her life entirely. Kendall, left alone with nowhere to go, was forced to take to the streets. At first, she stayed in shelters, finding temporary refuge in places where the staff were kind but overwhelmed. But she quickly realized the harsh reality: shelters were just a quick fix, a place to sleep and get food, but they didn't change anything about her situation. No one really cared for her long term, they just wanted to clear space for the next person. Living on the streets was a cold, isolating experience. Kendall learned quickly how to avoid the streetlights, how to keep her eyes down, and how to pretend she wasn't cold when she was. But the judgment from others was constant. She knew she was invisible to the majority of people who passed her by. They saw a homeless black woman and made assumptions about her life. They didn't know about her losses, her pain, the trauma that had brought her here. They didn't see the smart, determined woman who had once hoped for a better future. All they saw was a statistic, someone who had failed the system. The streets themselves were a dangerous place for someone like Kendall. With no family, no support system, she was at the mercy of a world that had no time for people like her. And yet, she fought to survive. Kendall was no stranger to hardship. She knew how to navigate the dark corners of the city, how to find food when there was none, and how to make it through the night. Her pride kept her from begging, her strength kept her from asking for help. But sometimes, the weight of it all was too much, and she found herself turning to whatever she could to numb the pain: drinking, using, doing anything to forget her constant struggle. Her resilience was a quiet thing, a flickering flame in the dark. But it was there, burning in her, driving her to survive even when it felt like she had nothing left to live for. One day, Kendall heard about a shelter run by activists, a place that promised more than just food and beds. It promised a chance for real change. It was a long shot, but Kendall had learned never to give up hope entirely. She made her way there, hoping that maybe this time, someone would see her for who she was, a person, not a problem. But when she entered the shelter, there was a familiar face. Elena. The activist who had spoken so passionately about racial equality at the protests. But Kendall wasn't sure she was ready to trust her again. Her last encounter had left her feeling invisible, like just another face in a sea of problems. She gathered the courage to approach Elena, desperate for help. "Excuse me, Elena," she said softly, I just need some help, a meal, a place to stay." Elena, in her usual rush, barely glanced up. "Sorry," she said dismissively. "You should try the intake desk." Kendall's heart sank. Despite Elena's lectures on equality and justice, when it came to a real, vulnerable person standing before her, Elena saw only another problem to manage. Elena's role in the movement had only grown since the protest that had first sparked her doubt. She was now a central figure, known for her fiery speeches and powerful presence. She led rallies, attended conferences, and organized workshops about racial justice and systemic inequality. Her name was synonymous with activism in the city, and her image graced posters and social media pages. Elena felt powerful, her voice had a reach, and she was celebrated as a beacon of change. But with that growing fame came a creeping detachment, a sense of disconnect between the idealized world she was fighting for and the reality of those living in the trenches. Her days were filled with meetings, interviews, and speeches. There were always events to attend, people to inspire, causes to push forward. It wasn't that Elena had stopped caring about the issues she fought for, it was just that the world of activism had become more about maintaining her image and less about connecting with the people she wanted to help. The grassroots reality of the struggle, the long, painful days of those who had to survive systemic oppression, was growing more distant from Elena's polished, well-organized campaign. She was no longer a part of the community she spoke for, she was above it, on a stage, preaching to the masses, detached from the day-to-day reality of those who had no voice in the movement. And yet, despite her growing recognition, Elena couldn't forget Kendall. Every time she spoke about racial inequality and the fight for justice, the image of the homeless woman haunted her. Was this really making a difference? How could she call herself a true advocate when she couldn't even help someone standing right in front of her? Then, one day, Kendall showed up at one of Elena's protests. Her face was tired, her clothes tattered, but there she was, standing on the fringes of the crowd, looking lost but determined. She had heard the call for justice, the promises of change, and thought maybe, just maybe, this was where she belonged. Kendall hesitated, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Elena. There she was, standing tall, delivering another passionate speech about dismantling the systems that kept people like Kendall oppressed. This was the moment, maybe this time, Elena would recognize her, really see her, and help her. But when Kendall approached, asking for a simple meal or a safe place to sleep, Elena barely paused. "Sorry," Elena said quickly, offering Kendall a granola bar from her bag, "I don't have time right now. You can talk to the outreach team over there." Kendall took the granola bar, but it wasn't help. It was charity, a token gesture that didn't even address the real problem. Elena brushed her off without a second thought, dismissing her just as she had done before. The crowd around her cheered, oblivious to the real-life struggles just steps away. It was a performance, and Elena played her role well. But then, something shifted. As Elena moved through the crowd, she saw Kendall again. This time, she was standing near the edge, eyes downcast, ignored by the people around her. Other activists who had come to the protest looked at her with dismissive expressions, avoiding any real interaction. They too saw her as just another face in the crowd, another person to help in theory, but not in practice. Elena's heart sank. This wasn't the world she had imagined, this wasn't the change she had fought for. She had spent all her energy speaking about systemic change, but here was a woman who needed more than speeches, she needed real action. Elena's self-image as a leader, a fighter for justice, cracked in that moment. Was she truly part of the movement, or was she just playing a part? The realization hit hard. Her activism had been hollow, disconnected from the very people she claimed to fight for. She had built a platform, but she had failed to truly see those at the bottom. The weight of her hypocrisy began to press on her chest, and she realized that real change wasn't about rallies or slogans, it was about seeing people like Kendall, understanding their struggles, and acting in ways that made a real difference in their lives. The protest had ended, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The chants, the signs, the passionate speeches, it all felt hollow now. As the crowd dispersed, she stood at the edge of the gathering, the noise fading into the background. Her mind kept returning to Kendall. The woman had been there, standing on the periphery, invisible to the people who claimed to fight for justice. Elena had brushed her off again, handed her a granola bar like it was enough, when what Kendall really needed was something far more profound. Elena had done exactly what she had always condemned, the easy, performative act of charity that never really addressed the root of the problem. As she walked home that evening, Elena's internal monologue grew louder. She had built her life around fighting for equality, speaking about the injustices of systemic racism and oppression. But how genuine had her fight been if she couldn't even take the time to help one person in need? How could she continue calling herself an activist when the very people she was supposed to help were invisible to her, dismissed with a glance? Elena realized, with an overwhelming sense of guilt, that she had been operating from a place of privilege. She had always known what the right thing was to do, the right words to say, but had she ever truly understood what it meant to live in the system she was fighting against? She had spent her life surrounded by safety, opportunity, and education. Her struggle had never been survival, never a daily fight for food, shelter, or dignity. Her activism had been theoretical, rooted in abstract ideas, while the reality for people like Kendall was raw, painful, and real. Elena's mind raced, and for the first time, she realized that her views on justice had been shaped more by her comfort and her privilege than by an actual understanding of the oppression she spoke about. The guilt of it weighed heavily on her chest, and she knew she needed to change, she needed to listen, to step beyond her own narrow understanding of equality, and truly understand what people like Kendall were going through. The next day, Elena reached out to Kendall. She felt nervous, unsure of what to expect. Kendall had every right to turn her away, to see Elena as just another activist with good intentions but no real understanding. But when Kendall answered, her voice was cautious yet open. "I've been thinking about what you said," Elena began, her voice full of sincerity. "I've realized that I don't understand what you're going through. And I want to. I want to listen." Kendall was quiet for a moment, then responded softly, "All right, Elena. But you've got to know. It's not just about what you want to hear. It's about listening to the pain, the real stuff." Kendall began to share her story, of losing her mother, of being abandoned by her brother, of battling addiction and homelessness. She spoke about the mental toll it had taken, the nights spent cold and hungry, the people who looked right through her. She talked about feeling like a ghost in a city full of people who pretended not to see her. "I didn't ask for any of this," Kendall said, her voice breaking, "but here I am, just trying to survive, and every day it feels like I'm invisible." The conversation was raw, and Elena could feel the weight of Kendall's words settle in her heart. She had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from someone standing right in front of her, someone she had failed to help, was different. Elena felt the truth of it, the deep, painful reality of what Kendall and so many others like her faced every day. It wasn't a political issue, it was personal. It wasn't a theory, it was life and death. By the end of the conversation, Elena felt a profound shift in her perspective. It wasn't just about activism anymore, it was about personal responsibility. True change wasn't found in speeches or protests. It was about showing up, listening, and doing the hard work that went beyond charity. Elena understood now that real systemic change required empathy, action, and the willingness to confront her own privilege. It wasn't enough to talk about equality, she had to live it. Elena stood at the window of her apartment, looking out at the busy city streets below. It had been weeks since her conversation with Kendall, but the lessons from that moment had completely reshaped her view of activism. Elena had spent so long fighting for change from the safety of her platform, speaking about equality, writing articles, attending rallies, but she now realized that true change came from more than just words. It came from the messy, real work of engaging with people, listening to their stories, and offering more than just temporary solutions. She had made a decision: she would no longer stand at the front of protests and call for justice without taking action herself. Her previous efforts, while well-intentioned, had been detached. It was time for her to step into the reality of the struggle, to connect with those she had spoken for, and to do the hard work of truly understanding and helping them. Elena reached out to Kendall again. This time, she didn't just offer a granola bar or a vague promise of help. She asked what Kendall needed, what real, immediate steps could be taken to offer her not just temporary relief, but a chance at stability and a future. Kendall, at first hesitant, slowly began to open up. She talked about her desire to get clean, to find steady work, and to finally break the cycle of homelessness. Elena listened, fully present, not just as an activist, but as someone who genuinely cared. They worked together to get Kendall into a rehabilitation program. Elena used her connections to secure a bed for Kendall at a treatment center, but she didn't stop there. She helped Kendall navigate the complex world of housing assistance, applying for public benefits, and securing a job. But more than anything, Elena made herself available, not as a savior, but as a partner. She built a relationship with Kendall based on mutual respect, not charity. She no longer saw Kendall as just a victim of systemic injustice, but as an individual with strengths, agency, and the ability to change her life, with the right support. Elena's work with Kendall sparked something in her, a new direction for her activism. She began to see the gaps in the systems she had once championed. Homeless Black women like Kendall were often overlooked, their struggles compounded by racism, gender inequality, and a lack of support. So, Elena took the lessons she had learned from her experience and channeled them into a new initiative, one specifically designed to support homeless Black women. It wasn't enough to just talk about the issues. Elena knew she had to provide a direct, ongoing, and practical solution. Her initiative started small but grew quickly, partnering with shelters, mental health services, job training programs, and legal aid groups to offer comprehensive support. It wasn't a one-time fix. It was a long-term commitment to addressing the root causes of homelessness and inequality, one woman at a time. As Elena watched the initiative grow, she realized that activism wasn't about how many people you could rally in one day or how loud your voice could be. It was about the quiet, consistent work, the behind-the-scenes efforts to create real, lasting change. True activism, she now understood, wasn't about grand speeches or lofty ideals. It was about showing up for the people who needed you, day after day, without expectation of recognition or praise. Elena had learned that the path to real change wasn't through grand gestures, it was through personal connections, understanding, and empathy. She wasn't just a voice for the voiceless anymore, she was walking beside them, helping to build the future they deserved.